government says it's the most ambitious and important infrastructure project for 30 years. It's certainly the biggest, stretching more than 300 miles from north to south. It will take almost 20 years to build, and when complete, they say it will be a driving force for the whole of the UK economy. Opponents say it's a waste of tens of billions of pounds, that it will needlessly rip through countryside and communities, and instead of bridging the economic divide between London and the South East and the rest of the country, actually make things worse. That's a very basic summary of what is a very complex, a very controversial, and a very emotive subject. Today, with our panel of invited guests and an audience of members of the public, we'll discuss and debate in more detail the project known as HS2. Here with us, Mike O'Brien, the former MP for North Warwickshire and Bedworth until 2010, who's recontesting the seat again in next year's general election, and is a critic of the high-speed line. Alan Marshall, the editorial director of Rail News, who says without HS2, Britain will fall out of the Premier League of world economies. Catherine Moore, Professor of Landscape Architecture at Birmingham City University, who argues HS2 doesn't have to be the blot on the landscape some think it will. Joe Rukin, coordinator of pressure group Stop HS2, who's been outspoken and active in his fight against the planned line. And Peter Hughes of the West Midlands branch of Rail Future, who support high-speed rail but think there are flaws with the plans for HS2. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel. So without further ado, can we have our first question, please?
Basically, for the next 20 years, places like Nuneaton are going to have a very negative impact from HS2. We're going to have Euston Station being either rebuilt or partly rebuilt, and eventually when phase 1 is complete, we're going to have a loss of some of our local services up the Trent Valley, because that's where the HS2 halfway point is. Basically, we gain nothing from HS2 and have 20 years of disruption. How can this be a useful thing for Nuneaton?
Alan Marshall, how can it be useful?
I think that your surmise about Nuneaton being worsened during the construction period of HS2 is completely off the ball. The service is already poor at Nuneaton because the long distance intercity services that used to call there were taken away from Nuneaton by the new Virgin timetable in 2008. You are gaining because of the London Midland service, which now serves there, which has become very popular. And that, of course, is going to get better in May this year because it will be fast between Milton Keynes and Rugby and not being diverted via Northampton, even in the peak period from May this year. You also mentioned the disruption caused by rebuilding Euston. In fact, we're not too sure what's going to happen at Euston. According to reports this morning, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is now in favour of a very substantial rebuilding of Euston. But I would say, even if HS2 isn't built, everybody better get used to the idea of disruption at Euston because it desperately needs rebuilding.
Mike O'Brien?
Nuneaton will be worse off, and so will significant parts of the country. The government put forward a report, KPMG report, in September 2013, which claimed there were all sorts of benefits, but when the detail of it was looked at, the calculations for some of those benefits to the overall economy were very questionable, but also there were areas of the UK which would lose. Now, places like Nuneaton would be best served if we were investing in good quality commuter railway systems and mass transit systems. Instead, we're investing in a prestige project for a first-class service for high-class people who can afford it. And that does not seem to me to be the right priority. And the result will be that about £7 billion of investment, which would otherwise go into the rest of the rail system, will probably be transferred. In fact, probably be much more than that. And if you actually said, look, we've got £50 billion that we want to invest in good quality transport, in my view, what you should be investing that in is ensuring that a commuter in the morning can get comfortably into work and back out again in the evening.
Peter Hughes, a prestige project.
Well, I'd just like to first of all say I agree with Mike O'Brien about rapid transit into the English cities. We desperately need that, but we want to get that as well as HS2. On the Nuneaton point, I really don't know what the problem is. Nuneaton, you're very lucky. By accident of history, you live on the West Coast Main Line. You have a very good rail service. I agree with every word Alan says, by the way. It doesn't leave me much to add. But just if you lived in Hinckley, you might have more to complain about.
Joe Rukin, I think people in Nuneaton, those views are reflected elsewhere, aren't they?
Well, the thing is that it's not just Nuneaton that lose out. There's loads of places up and down the country that will lose services as a result of HS2 and definitely have to suffer the disruption of building HS2, because proponents of HS2 have said that the alternatives would be disruptive without pointing out that HS2 itself would be disruptive. Like, rebuild Euston or not, doesn't really matter. You're still messing around with all the tracks going into Euston. So the disruption is going to be there for best part of a decade on the West Coast Main Line, and that will knock on to every town and city that is served by the West Coast Main Line via trains to Euston. But the other thing is, in terms of the disruption, going back to the point of Nuneaton's already got the bad end of the stick, because when the West Coast Main Line was upgraded a couple of years ago and it was done up, of course, Nuneaton lost direct trains to Leicester. You can't get a train from Coventry to Leicester because the track that allowed you to make that journey was removed when the station was supposedly done up. But it's not just the disruption that will happen from the construction of HS2 on the rails that is being ignored. It's the disruption that will be happening on the roads as well.
Professor Moore, disruptive, years of chaos.
I'm sure there's going to be disruption. I don't know the line as well as these people do here. I mean, the focus is on this 60 metre or 80 metre length of track that's going to go up and down the country. But it is one of the, as you said, one of the most extraordinary construction projects, infrastructure projects that we've seen for decades. And there's the opportunity to think of it in a different way, not just about reducing speed, but actually transforming a linear engineering project into an iconic landscape that can be a catalyst for wider social and economic transformation. And is about providing a legacy for the future and future generations. And I think that there's going to be disruption, but actually we have to have this bigger vision in view to see how we can make the most of it, make the best use of it, and use it in a very positive, progressive way to benefit all the communities along the route that it's going to impact, and as well as the towns and the cities that it's going to be nearby.
At this point, I would like to see whether any of our members of the audience have anything to comment immediately on what they've heard.
Hi, Stephanie Clifford from Rugby. I've spent the 10 years of the remodelling project commuting into Euston on and off, and the major disruption that was caused through that was, the end result was that we got, as you say, a mixed traffic railway where the high-speed trains get in the way of the slow trains and vice versa. So doing anything along those lines again would just be completely unacceptable, but not because of the disruption caused, and because the end result is not something that's worth having. The only way that I can see that we can get this capacity is to build a dedicated line which would take those high-speed trains out of the way, so our trains to Rugby, Northampton, Nuneaton can be given the space they need. I'd also, one other point on this is, I think that our track is very vulnerable at the moment because there just isn't any spare time for the maintenance to be carried out.
The question about maintenance is a very valid point. A report was done about 18 months ago by Chris Gibb, who was the former Chief Operating Officer of Virgin Trains, which identified a whole series of major problems with the infrastructure south of Rugby. And one of the most serious problems south of Rugby is the ability to maintain the fast line to London, because with health and safety considerations, engineers cannot work on that line without closing the other two on either side. So effectively you have to close the West Coast Main Line to do work on that line. But because of the pressure, the intensity of service that operates over the fast line to London, not all the work is done. The West Coast infrastructure is in a poor state despite £10 billion worth of investment. It is regularly Virgin trains are at the bottom, virtually every month, the bottom of the punctuality league, and East Coast trains are in a similar position. And that's largely down to infrastructure problems, not problems with the trains or the service given by the train operators.
Joe Rukin, we can't spend our time just maintaining what we have.
Well, absolutely we can. The fact of the matter is that you can deliver over 100% increase in capacity by investing in the existing infrastructure and deliver those benefits to more people more quickly and cost less money. Now, the reality is that HS2 is about long-distance passengers, and long-distance passenger growth has been dropping steadily for the last 4 years. The last figures for long-distance passenger growth were at 0.3%. And by investing in HS2, you're not really addressing the problem of capacity on the railways. You're addressing the issue of providing better trains for the people who do the longest journeys, i.e. the business elite. And when we talk of releasing capacity on the West Coast Main Line, that means losing the trains you already have. Releasing capacity can only mean losing the trains you already have. For example, we're here in Coventry. Coventry has 3 trains an hour to London as a result of being on the Birmingham to London service. If you take Birmingham to London and put it on high-speed rail, you cannot justify 3 trains an hour from London to Coventry. So you'll have fewer services. Well, you can shake your head, but it's actually in the HS2 business plan. The HS2 business plan calls for £8 billion worth of cuts to the existing rail infrastructure. And that will mean places like Coventry, Rugby, potentially Stafford, Wilmslow will lose all of its London services. Warrington, I could go on, loads of places in Scotland as well.
How do we know what the services will be like in 10, 15, 20 years' time? We don't know. Everybody seems to think that the line will be here today and everything will change tomorrow. That's not the situation. It's going to evolve over a long period of time. Well, even if David Higgins managed to foreshorten the programme, we're not going to see any major operation of high-speed services for at least 10 years, and the market is going to continue to change and grow in that period.
This is one of the great things about the proponents of HS2. If there is something in the HS2 plans that HS2 Limited have written down and said this is what's going to happen, but they don't actually like it because it doesn't help their cause, they completely ignore it and say, it's all speculative. But when you're talking about the benefits, then, they're all cast iron. Yeah. They're definitely going to happen.
I think HS2 have been too specific on trying to predict future services, trying to be helpful, but giving Joe and his friends ammunition. And they've also, in my view, disappointed us by trying to sell the line as a service to save 20 minutes from London to Birmingham. Big deal. We don't need that. We've got a good service already. And as Rail Future, we were hoping that they would try and broaden the debate and sell it as surely a way of getting from northern England and Scotland direct to the continent of Europe. Now, opponents have also said this London-Birmingham section might get built, then the money might run out, and then the politics change, and that short southern section is a white elephant. And I think they'd be right. So we advocate build the northern section first, Lichfield to Manchester and Leeds, the Y, and then you'd have to fill into London because London couldn't be without it.
Isn't it the case, the problem with this connectivity argument that somehow it will link Scotland and the north with the south, that the high-speed trains just don't tilt, and therefore the effect would be that in the lower part of the more southern part of the railway, it would be able to go at speed, but when it gets up towards Scotland, it has to slow down because it will go on the ordinary lines. It won't be able to tilt. It will go slower than Pendolino's. It therefore will take hardly anything off a trip to Scotland. It doesn't provide the level of connectivity that it advertises.
I'm sorry,
this is
phase
not
one.
High-speed rail the way that they've sold it. The real objective of connecting up this country should be to get good quality basic services in place. That's what we're lacking at the moment, and that's where we should be focusing our investment, not on a prestige project.
Well, I have to say again that you cannot improve the basic services unless you create the capacity for those services to operate, and at the moment the long distance trains are in the way of that improvement.